Hello, hello. Well, welcome to this online video where we're going to be talking about developing your own philosophy about teaching and learning. So let's hop into it. Before you get started in your first classroom, you really need to have a mental picture of yourself as a teacher. What's going to be important to you? What are your thoughts and beliefs about learning? You really need to examine your own assumptions. What are your beliefs when it comes to teaching, when it comes to learning, when it comes to who your students are? I thought that this little meme down below kind of fit the idea of you need to start challenging your own assumptions now because they color how you view the world. And I love here what Alan Alda says, the idea that scrub them off once in a while or the light won't come in because they are your window to the world. So where do your assumptions come from? Well, your assumptions come from your personal experiences. So in large part, your views as a teacher are going to come from way back your experiences as a student. Those things are connected to one another. So assumptions about learning. Some things that you're going to want to think about when it comes to re-examining and scrubbing off your assumptions. Where does learning come from? Does learning come from the teacher, or does it come from the work that you do as a student? Can students learn better from the teacher or from one another? What about homework? Is homework helpful or not? Does it reinforce skills? Does it teach them something new, or is it just a burden? Standardized tests, do they have a role in education? Are they accurate? Are they useful? So all of these things are going to play a big role in your views as a teacher, because what studies have shown is that teachers are, in large part, motivated by their assumptions. So let's just take it to a personal level, this little picture down below. So let's say you have two students who are talking to one another during some sort of a activity. Your assumptions about those students and about their motivations, about who they are as learners, is going to affect how you approach those students, whether you come up to them and assume that they have good or bad intentions. Same thing with all those assumptions that we looked at on the previous page, just to take a peek backwards. So how you feel about where learning comes from. The second one, can students learn better from teachers or peers? If you think that students learn well from peers, you will have lots of group assignments. If you don't think that's the case, you probably won't. All these things, again, will change and in some ways motivate your teaching. So here's something else to think about. What about your assumptions when it comes to different groups of students? So I saw this article, 5 False Assumptions About Teaching Students of Color. So these are assumptions that I personally have heard teachers and students say, but these are things that are false. Like number 1, you have to be mean, strict, and very tough because that's all they know. That is an assumption that teachers might have when they walk into those urban classrooms, but that's not true. And that is going to alter how they teach, and perhaps in a negative way. These students need very high structure because they have so little structure at home. Well, how do you know they have little structure at home? And from what we know about trauma-informed care, if they are students who are having difficulties, that structure may or may not be helpful to them. So again, you can see that the assumptions we have can be hurtful or perhaps even helpful in the classroom, depending on what they are. But they all come from our experiences. So the next thing we want to look at is, what is a teaching philosophy? If that's what the majority of this chapter about, well, what is it? Your teaching philosophy is your personal thoughts, your beliefs, your expectations, even your assumptions that guide your teaching and guide how you feel about learners and how they learn best. So this picture down below is because at some point in your career, and who knows, we might even do it in this class, you're going to need to write down your teaching philosophy. It could be part of your resume when you go to apply for a job, or they might have you write an essay about it. This is something you're going to need to think about and, put words to paper at some point. But what about the question of, does it change over time? Do you think it stays the same, or is it something that is malleable? We have found that yes, it does change over time. So if for this class I have you write your teaching philosophy, and then you pull it back out when you're a senior, you're going to see a big change. You might look at some things and go, wow, I can't believe that that's how I felt back then. As you learn more, as you gain experiences and richness of understandings, your attitudes and your opinions are going to change. And that will cause sometimes subtle, sometimes significant changes in your personal teaching philosophy. Here's a short video that talks a little bit about the idea of your teaching philosophy. I think we can see a lot about what this particular individual's teaching philosophy is by all of these statements. You see that she wants her students to feel welcomed and safe, that she wants them to be active participants. She wants to include hands-on learning, group projects. It tells you a lot about her perspectives on learning. And pardon the typo over there, I suppose we're all capable of making those. So while you are developing your own teaching philosophy, which as I said is going to occur for all of you and all of us in the field of teaching, there are some questions that all of us really need to ponder and think about how we feel about. Like, what is the role of the teacher? There was the idea in the past of the sage on the stage, that the teacher was the one who stood up front and held court and shared his or her wisdom. Is that the role of the teacher? Or is the teacher to be a facilitator for discussions? Is the teacher one that is supposed to light the fire to motivate you? There are a lot of possibilities. What is the role of the student? What is the student's job? Is the student passive and they just sit there and take it all in? Or is the student doing as much or more work than the teacher? So what's the student's role in your classroom? What's the purpose of schooling? Why are we all here? Are we here to prepare you for a job? Are we here to create good citizens? Or are we here to share a wealth of knowledge? that all human beings crave? What is the purpose of schooling? What curriculum should we be teaching? Should it be the same everywhere? Should it differ based upon student interests? And how should we teach this curriculum? Should we be using hands-on strategies or interactive discussions or expository lectures? What should we do? And then finally, what is the point of all this? What is the purpose of learning? So, some really big questions to wrap your mind around. And while going through this issue of developing your own teaching philosophy, there's something else we need to consider, and that is the role of your personal stories. So, we have found that defining moments in your life can alter how you view things. So, your own teaching philosophy, your own perceptions are altered by what you've been through in life. So, these stories, these personal, meaningful moments in your life provide you with ideas, tools for working towards goals, creating new goals perhaps. I've seen in our textbook and others call these points, these personal stories, reservoirs of wisdom, or aha moments in your life where the light bulb went off and you suddenly started looking at things differently. So think back to your own personal education and some of those aha moments for you. They may have been positive, like these ones over here, achievements, times that you felt successful or you learned something that you felt was quite challenging, or they could have been moments of perhaps defeat or mistakes, or moments when you felt negative emotions in the classroom. And those can be aha moments as well, things that you don't want to repeat again. All of these, the good and the bad, shape your point of view about teaching and learning and about the purpose of schools. Some other ways that we might view these ideas of stories is thinking about how these important events might have affected you, and if you can understand that, you can better understand your own philosophical perspectives. So for instance, if I firmly believe in the importance of students feeling safe and welcome in my classroom, and that they have to feel safe in order to learn, and they have to feel safe in order to share, maybe that stems back to an event in my childhood during schooling where I felt unsafe, where I saw another student get bullied or picked on, or where I saw the importance of how that would help with learning. So it's important to see that connection between those early stories and how you view things now. Some examples of other big events that have affected all of us. So we talked about Sputnik in one of our earlier chapters and how that changed Americans' view of the importance of science and technology. What about 9/11? Or school shootings, and that might affect how your students feel about safety in the classroom. And now with COVID, not only does that alter how we view safety, and this is talking about COVID again, but how we view the importance of social interaction, looking at different ways to have social interaction, looking at the role of technology in the classroom. I think that COVID is going to be one of those big moments for a lot of us to really review what teaching is and how teaching can take place and how learning occurs, let alone the importance of that human factor. So I thought I'd just toss that question out to you. What about you? How do you think COVID has changed your point of view on education? This generation of college students who are going through this now, when you graduate, you're going to have a much different perspective than the students who are ahead of you. And I don't know exactly what that's going to be yet. We're going to have to see where this takes us, but it's certainly going to change your point of view about the role of teaching and schooling and learning. But continuing, while we're looking again still at this idea of these personal stories, I want to point out that your teaching needs to be intentional. That is a really important word. In fact, when I teach educational psychology and I talk about how to be an effective teacher, that's one of the defining traits, intentional teaching. And what that means is teaching is done with purpose. You don't go in and the phrase fly by the seat of your pants or improvise necessarily an entire day's worth of lessons. What you do has to be goal-oriented, having specific outcomes in mind. So you know what your learning outcomes are, and all the little things you do are directing you and your students toward those learning outcomes. All right, so let's switch topics a little bit now, and we're going to be talking about pedagogy and instruction. Let's take a look at these two very important terms, and we'll start with pedagogy. And I like this little definition here that pedagogy is the art and science of being a teacher. I don't know if you've ever thought of it that way, but teaching is both an art and a science. Art is the creative expression side, the idea of how you're going to teach your lessons and coming up with creative ways of getting your students to think about things and creative ways to assess your students. And the science is the reasoning behind that. The idea of looking at what research says in terms of what effective practices are, using careful observations of looking at your students and seeing what works and what doesn't work, assessing what their prior knowledge is to figure out how to move forward, and really paying attention to students' responses to your lessons. So using both your own careful observations as well as reading the research from educational psychologists to see again what is effective and what isn't, and using that to make decisions. So pedagogy is your belief system that you bring with you to the classroom. This is everything we've been talking about, this idea of your teaching philosophy, what you have in your head about what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a student, and what learning is. Your personal teaching philosophy is your pedagogy, the idea that this is, and then it's expressed through your instructional practice. So pedagogy is what you have in your head, your teaching philosophy. Your instructional practice is what you're actually doing, the act or process of teaching. So in my head, I believe that peers learn best perhaps by interacting with one another and by sharing their ideas with the teacher and answering questions. That would be in my pedagogy. In my instruction, I would be sure to include lots of questions to try to encourage discussion in the classroom and so forth. So instruction is how your pedagogy is expressed in the classroom. I hope that makes sense. So here's another way of viewing it. So pedagogy could be, I believe, and this is what's in my head, I believe students need to feel a sense of community to feel connected and to learn. So the way that might manifest is that in the classroom I use things like icebreakers and things to get students to know one another and feel comfortable with each other. All right, here's going to be where we pause. So this will be the end of part 1. And for part 2, we're going to move on to looking at how do students learn.